afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Helen Avery with the Green Finance Institute, and a very warm welcome to this Investment Readiness Fund session, Investable Success Stories. It's designed to support applicants to the IRF, but also anyone keen to hear about financing nature. And we have a lot of participants joining us here today, which is great to see. We have 4 presenters today who are going to be sharing their nature-based projects and talking us through their path to securing finance beyond grants. And I'll introduce them in a moment. But before I do, I wanted to invite Dan Barwick from DEFRA to say a few words. Dan.
Thank you, Helen. Hi, everyone. As Helen said, my name is Dan Barwick. I work in DEFRA's domestic green finance team, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to give you a brief intro to the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, which we're currently in the process of designing to open for applications in the new year. So first, a big thank you to the GFI for leading these sessions and for the expert panelists, and indeed to the EKN for hosting as part of the conference. We're also staging stakeholder sessions led by the Environment Agency, who will deliver the IRF on behalf of the DEFRA group. And these sessions will go into more detail on how we're proposing the IRF will operate, so we can get stakeholder views to inform our thinking on that. And we'll provide details on those sessions later for people who haven't already signed up and want to do so. So a very quick intro to the IRF. At its core, the IRF will be a competitive grant program to enable natural environment project developers to boost their capacity and procure the specialist advice and expertise they need to develop their project to the stage that it's ready to receive and operate on repayable investment. So it will be a technical assistance program rather than a fund that makes capital investments into projects on the ground. So we're interested in receiving bids from projects that can broadly do 2 things. Number 1, protect and enhance the natural environment in line with the 25-year environment plan. And number 2, generate revenue from ecosystem services in order to attract and repay investment. So the exact investment readiness needs will obviously vary from project to project, but it could include support and advice on things like financial modeling, revenue generation, investment structuring, capital raising, governance advice, investor due diligence, impact measurement, the list goes on, etc., etc. And we want it to provide the flexibility to meet the needs of the specific projects. So we've drawn inspiration from the social investment sector, which has developed exponentially over the last 10 or 15 years, supported by public investment readiness funding. And while we see this kind of capacity and capability building support as a crucial step in helping to build a pipeline of investable natural environment projects, we realise it's only one part of the support needed, and we need to align other sources of public funding to enable blended investment, and we need the right enabling policy and regulation. So I'll leave it there for now. I'm very much looking forward to the GFI sessions, and as I said, we'll provide details of the EA stakeholder sessions on the IRF later in today's session. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. So I'm pleased to introduce our 4 presenters for today in the order of how they're going to appear. So we have Alan McDonnell, Conservation Projects Manager for Trees for Life, Gwyn Williams, Head of Conservation Investment at RSVB, Eric Letzinger, Founder and CEO of Quantified Ventures, and Darius Sasha, Investment Director with the SLM Silver Fund. So each of our presenters is going to present for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So rather than save your questions for the end, we really encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A panel while the presenters are speaking, and we're going to collect those at the end and then choose 2 or so, depending on our time, for each presenter, and that's going to allow us to stay on track today. We really wanted you to hear as many projects as we could in this short time. If it's going to be unclear who your question is for, please just note the name of the presenter in the question that you post. Also, we're only taking questions today on the projects that you're going to hear about and not on the IRF. If you have questions on the IRF, we'll provide an email at the end. So on to our first presenter today, and it's going to be Alan from Trees for Life from Scotland, sharing about the development of a rewilding centre at Dundragon and also their experience with carbon credits. So over to you, Alan. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Helen, and hi everybody. Yeah, my name is Alan McDonald. I'm Conservation Manager at Trees for Life. So I'm an ecologist and not an investment manager, but I want to share a couple of stories today about our kind of journey into this world, which we find is one of continuing discovery. As you explained, we're a charity, smallest charity of about 25 staff, and we're all about rewilding in the Scottish Highlands, and our particular take on rewilding, which is to put people right at the heart of the land, and to bed nature in with that. So next slide, please. First project I want to talk about is based on a place called Dundragon. This is the first area of land and the only area of land that Trees for Life has acquired. It's about 4,000 hectares, and we bought it just about 11 years ago. And it's been another real journey for us. It's really changed the charity in a way that's given us credibility with the landowning sector, but also one that has brought us all kinds of challenges. And early on, so in the very early days, brought us into some very uncomfortable conversations with banks, because just with the experience of the charity in owning land, the bankruptcy became a real issue just around cash flow. So we really struggled in those early days and had some really traumatic times, and continued sort of over the years since then to look at, well, how do we meet these running costs of 6 figures plus per year, going into just managing the land, but also what you can see there in that picture is our tree nursery, our native tree nursery, which is entirely manually operated. So we've got staff costs to run that, staff costs to run a volunteering program out of the building in the centre there. So sustaining that has been a real battle of ups and downs for the charity, and they've looked over the years at different ideas to bring in revenue, none of which have stuck. We looked at a hydro development, we looked at wind, we even looked at a caravan park, but none of those have stacked up, and none of them felt right for us. Next slide, please. So this became our motto: go big or go home. And we decided that we need to create revenue that could cover the cost of Dundragon, ideally drive revenue into the charity overall. And we looked in particular, one of the biggest strengths of Dundragon is that it's immediately on the main road to Skye. So it's on a big tourist route for the Highlands. Lots of people travelling to and from Inverness to Skye, and passing other attractions on the way. So we developed this idea, just slowly took root within us, and we wanted to develop a place that people could come and where we could convey our message. Rewilding is a word that means all sorts of different things to different people, and we want to put our stamp on it, and to allow people to experience what we mean by it, and to do that in a way that would create revenue, but would also would match our values and keep us comfortable in this kind of sphere of being a charity that's looking to create profit. So the idea of a rewilding centre came to mind, and we developed the site concept has grown as a place where people can come and experience what rewilding is all about for themselves. This is currently a £5 million project, so a major increase in scale for us, and quite a big project anyway. And it's been through a number, and we had to iterate through business planning a number of times. So, and that was all about how can we get an accurate idea of what the income will be, what the profitability of it will be, and design our budget around that. And to do that, we engaged experts in the field. We were really lucky to get hold of a consultancy that's worked on Universal Studios and Disneyland, places that could, they had an algorithm which allowed them to say, well, if you provide this kind of experience, then you'll get this number of visitors, and here's the amount of revenue you can expect for that. Here's how you can project your income, and to do that in a reliable way based on experience around the world and calibrated for the Highlands. So that started to give us the confidence, but also told us that we would need to really going back to go big or go home, we needed to build bigger, and it added nearly 2 million quid to our initial budget. So we then set about the challenge of how we find that. And there's traditional grant funding in that budget for some of the charitable based activities that will run from this centre. There's some of our own money in it. We've got about 10% of it from our own funding, and actually through carbon, which I'll just about to come on and talk about. But the key piece in the jigsaw was impact investment and using Treodos's investor crowdfunding platform. So that project is soon to go online. And that is where we are confident, and Treodos having tested the business plan and tested the rationale to destruction, that's where we're confident that the remainder of the funding can come from, and that over time that will drive the centre forward. Next slide, please. So this is about kind of being able to build and learn as we go, and it's really important to us that the centre is free to access, so that anyone can come and see what it's about. But we also have, crucially, those paid for experiences that create the revenue, along with this is the accommodation, the drawing of the accommodation that we plan to provide for a range of groups. That's quite key to revenue, as is being able to provide food. So there's a cafe in the main centre. The way we can work with Treodos allows the loan can be paid back, but we can reinvest some of the profits as we go. So we've got a 10-year payback period, but we're able to add experiences and add facilities to the centre through that period, so we can continue to refresh it, continue to keep drawing business, and learn what works as it feels, learn how people respond to it, and learn what drives us forward. So that's again, that has helped give us and help give Treodos the confidence we need to invest this way, and I think we can develop a sustainable facility that can really meet our goals. And we're really confident about how that will work. So next slide, please. And then lastly, I just wanted to talk about carbon that I mentioned there. Carbon sequestration is a word on everybody's lips as we talk about the climate emergency and the scope to sequester carbon through land use and land use change. And obviously for a charity like Trees for Life, it's all about creating native woodland and rewilding the land. There's real scope there. It's been identified. So we have our own carbon product that is validated under the Woodland Carbon Code at Dundragon, and we've used that to sort of explore the market, try and find out where the price is, and have a bit of a blunder about, basically, to see what the market can stand, what we'll pay for, what people are looking for. We've adopted quite a premium approach to it, so our carbon is currently at the high end of the market. And we're achieving higher prices because of the narrative we're able to tell about around the carbon. This isn't just tree planting to sequester carbon. This is primarily about rewilding and the biodiversity benefits that bring, and the ecological restoration story that comes with that. So we're finding that an interesting experience. But the main reason we're looking at carbon is to influence others. If we want to rewild the Highlands, then we need to be able to persuade other landowners and people with control over land that that's a good way to go. And being able to facilitate and provide people with access just to the carbon market at all, because to many people it's still a very abstract subject, but also to say, if you do it with us, if you do it with Trees for Life and have a rewilding approach to it, you can command a higher price. Then we need to develop the rationale behind that. We're particularly keen on being able to achieve carbon sequestration through natural regeneration, because that gives the best ecological outcomes. And that brings an extra challenge. Well, how can you confirm and be confident that your natural regeneration will actually take hold in what is often quite a challenging environment with the constraints on tree growth in the Highlands, both from the severity of the soils and the condition of the soils in it, but pressure from herbivores, particularly red deer. So our focus for now is on transparency and evidence. They're the key for us. If we can show both landowners, but also potential carbon buyers and people who are interested in biodiversity impact, what that looks like physically and what that means physically, and some of the changes that start to happen in the first 5 and 10 years of a planting scheme, how that starts to sequester carbon and improve biodiversity, then that's the rationale that we can base a really strong offer on. So that's our focus on how we're hoping to make these viable and valuable ways forward for influencing land use change in a positive way going forward. The only thing I'd add to that is there's a greyer area again about social capital and speaking to our views on how people should be part of a rewilded landscape. There's something to explore there, but that for us, that feels really kind of abstract and obscure, but we're keen to look into that and see what the scope is there. But hopefully that gives you just a very quick summary of how we're thinking and how we're hoping to take all this forward. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alan. Trees for Life's close to my heart. I had the pleasure of going to Dundragon. Was it last year? It feels like a lifetime ago. I can't remember, but was it really last year? So thank you so much for sharing that with us. I can see questions coming in, so you've definitely inspired lots of people. Our next presenter is Gwyn Williams of the RSPB. Welcome again, Gwen, sharing an England-based project to protect the Soul Bunting with the support of a bank loan and biodiversity net gain. So really looking forward to hearing you share, Gwen. All yours.
Thank you, Helen. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do in this talk really is to share two things with you. Part of this our organisational journey, if you like, in exploring the use of conservation finance, and then the second part, the project itself. Next, please. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the RSPB. We're a nature conservation charity supported by over 1 million members. We're very much focused on addressing the twin climate and nature crises, about which we've been hearing a lot. And we have a broad approach around advocacy, public engagement and conservation delivery. We manage around 261,000 hectares, and we're working in the UK, UCOTS and globally. And traditionally, we've been a cash balance organisation, so money comes in, money goes out, and we try and make sure the two balance with about 100 million resources a year. Next, please. And through that model, we are delivering some quite large projects for peat bog restoration, managed realignment projects. We're working with BirdLife partners in countries like Gola, to secure and protect a major rainforest using REDD+, and things like in Tristan in the UCOT supporting the creation by the administration there of a huge marine protected area. Next, please. So we came to the kind of conclusion that you've been hearing in earlier presentations around the donative and public resources really are not going to meet the scale of crises that we're facing. So how do we invest? How do we attract investment, and how do we get investment working to deliver carbon negative and nature positive solutions? And part of this really being how do we as a sector really create projects at scale, given one of the challenges is just that, you know, too many of our projects really are too small at the moment to attract investment finance. Next, please. So we've had 3 years ago, we created an internal innovation program trying to match projects to finance and to start creating that pipeline and giving us the organizational confidence to do it, and trying to use that also as a platform to influence wider policy. And in that we've been very much helped by people like Triodos, but particularly Finance Earth, who've helped really us to understand the value that our projects are supplying and how we can make that investable. And from that, we've ended up with a sort of dedicated team, the innovation program that's beginning to mature, and where we're acting as a service team to the rest of the organization to help create solutions. Next, please. So the project I'd like to describe rests around this bird called the Soul Bunting. It's about the size of a sparrow. Next, please. It was once found all over southern England. It was very much associated with traditional mixed agriculture. And as the combine harvester was introduced and agriculture intensified and became more specialized, this was one of these species that was very much impacted by that change. And got through the 1947 winter well because there was still abundant seed in farmland, but 1963, 79, 81, massive contractions of range. So by 1989, really 118 pairs in the whole of the UK, just on the South Devon coast. Next, please. And then we put in a big research program and used the results to influence farmers using agri-environment measures to achieve recovery. So by 2020, 1,200 pairs. Next, please. But then housing development beginning to impact on that recovery as places like Exeter, the Torbay, Newton Abbot wanting to expand. And the Soul Bunting was identified as a UK Biodiversity Action Plan species and identified in local planning policy as a species which, if housing impacted on a territory, then Section 106 income would be used to provide compensatory habitat. And we tapped into this in 2008 to supply to acquire habitat at a place called Labrador Bay. And this was supplied as in lieu habitat, so after the event, post-loss. And you can see all of the things that the bird needs in there in terms of large headies, meadows, and arable habitat for stubbles in winter. And very successful in increasing the population. Next, please. But the next step in this really was thinking about how do we supply habitat banks in advance of loss, and we had the opportunity to acquire land just west of Teignmouth. At the time, our acquisition budget was quite taxed, so we started thinking about the use of debt finance, and we were able to essentially use donative money to acquire the land on the basis of an understanding with Teambridge that they would be willing to supply the money necessary to recoup that through Section 106 income, of which about 200,000 was immediately available, but the balance of about another 650,000 would be coming over the next few years. And based on that, we were able to go out into the market and obtain loan finance from Lloyds Bank to essentially refinance our use of donative income. And that leaves us with a responsibility to Teambridge to safeguard the population in that area of 52 pairs and to raise it to 85 pairs in a 7-year period. And Teambridge retains first charge on the land. So if we default in that, they can claim the land back. Next, please. So here's our kind of traditional model of RSPB using donative income to acquire land and maybe getting that support back from working with an LPA using developer contributions. And what we've done here, next slide, is to utilize the Lloyds borrowing facility to essentially recoup that donative money and to release it elsewhere to deliver a charitable purpose. So in our view, this becomes a scalable model. In the the next step would be to establish something like an investment fund of the kind that we've heard from Wolf and Finance Earth. Next slide, please. So a few reflections. I mean, for us, I think the elements in success has been a very clear regulatory framework that has been established by government and nationally and Teambridge locally to create that supply of funds and give confidence in the way that it can be used to create habitat. The investment that we've made over the years in conservation science to understand the needs of the species, the quality of the financial advice and support that we've received from Finance Earth, a willing vendor, and our presence on the ground in this area for getting on for 3 decades that have given us, I guess, confidence and people having confidence in our position in the community to make this work. There were a few small issues around security for the loan because as TDC, Teambridge had first charge, the loan couldn't be secured against the land. But I think in this case, the RSPB balance sheet and the nature of the contract we had with Teambridge was sufficient for Lloyds to see this as pretty secure. There are some underlying risks and uncertainties. So the timing of the 106 income to RSPB to repay the loan is not entirely secure. I'm sure it will arrive, but it is contingent on development happening. And ultimately, the underlying farming system, which is a small-scale mixed farming system that has been sustained into this period, that itself is not necessarily secure and it will be very interesting to see what happens with Brexit and whether the agriculture bill and the promise of public money for public goods is sufficient to underpin that farming system for this species. But for now, I mean, I think it's been a very successful scheme, I think, in countering immediate development pressure. And last slide. And just to say, you know, thank you to our partners in this, Team Bridge, who we're contracted to, Lloyd's as lender, Finance Earth as advisor, and Hewittson's our solicitors, who did a grand job on bringing all the legal stuff together. So thank you very much.
Always forget to unmute. Thanks, Grish. It's such a unique model for financing. I'm so glad you were able to share it with us, and such important work, and congratulations on your successes. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Our next presenter, we're actually heading over to the US now. So welcome again to Eric Letzinger. Thanks for joining us in this holiday week for you. And me. Eric's going to be sharing about Quantified Ventures' various outcomes-based models for nature in the US, from sustainable agriculture all the way through to bike tracks. So thank you so much, Eric. It's all yours.
Thanks, Alan. And thanks, everybody, for having me. What a treat to be here and hear about all these other great successes that you're having. I'm Eric Letzinger. I'm the CEO of Quantified Ventures. We'll go to the next slide, and we'll plow through these pretty quickly here. I'll just tell you a little bit about Quantified Ventures, a little bit about the financing tool that we use, which is outcomes-based financing. Take you through a couple case studies, and looking forward to the Q&A session later. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So we are an outcomes-based capital firm, which is a little bit of a mouthful, and we develop projects, partnerships, and innovative financial structures that are meant to drive big, impactful, bold environmental, health, and social transformations and impact. Let's go to the next slide. So these are, in general on the planet here, we face some big challenges, whether it's water quality or homelessness or water quantity, wildfires, food scarcity. These are the issues that Quantified Ventures are leaning into with our outcomes-based financing models. Let's go to the next slide. So we start with the basic premise that these are complicated puzzles. We certainly haven't found the easy button. Let us know if you have. We'd like to use it. These are complex challenges and big issues that we're leaning into. We start with the basic premise that certainly on our side of the pond, budgets are strained. Government budgets are strained and getting strainer. Can that be a word? But investors are motivated and they're diverse, and and as they get more and more interested in connecting their capital with impact and willing to take a bet on whether outcomes actually occur or not, things start to get interesting as federal discretionary spending for the things that we're certainly passionate about at Quantified Ventures. Here's a source of capital with impact capital. We see curves going in a positive direction, which gives us some courage to continue to lean forward into some of these puzzles. Okay, let's go to the next slide. We approach our work. Let me just be clear, our business model is a little bit of a mess. We do a lot of advisory work. We do a lot of project development work where sometimes we're the developer and sometimes we're the investor. And I think that flexibility in business models allows us to not be a hammer looking for a nail. So we get to fail a lot and learn from our failings and apply them and continue to plow forward towards a bigger solution. Okay, let's move to the next slide. We focus in 4 practice areas. We have a forestry and land use, and by the way, I'll take you through a case study of each one of these. We have a forest and land use practice. We have an urban and coastal resilience practice. We have an agriculture practice and a health and human services practice. Let's move to the next slide. There's a bunch of awesome organizations that we are lucky enough to get to work with. And I'll make these slides available if anybody's interested. I won't make you belabor this. Let's go to the next slide. All right, let's talk about outcomes-based financing in particular. What is it? Let's go to the next slide. So at the end of the day, and rather than study this slide in a very short period of time, I wanted to make it available to everybody. We are trying to enable the government to pay for outcomes on the back end as opposed to process and programs on the front end. I've spent a third of my career running agencies at the government level, and we tend, on this side of the pond, we tend to pay for everything on the front end and kind of hope for the best. We don't invest in a lot in the United States here in evaluating the efficacy of our public sector dollars, and what this model enables government to do is just to kind of skip all that and just buy the outcome. And that's a concept that's fairly mind-blowing for a lot of our public sector realms at the municipal, state, and federal level, but we're making really good progress here, chipping away at that simple notion. Let's move to the next slide. The benefits are to the government are things like accessing new investors who are wanting to get connected directly with impact, and more simply is transferring the risk, the performance risk of the intervention or the program or the thing that's being funded from the government to the investors. And with this new source of impact investors, we're finding healthy appetite to take that risk off of the government's shoulders. And the other thing we like about this outcomes-based financing, it has a non-optional component to it to rigorously measure whether the outcomes happened or not. You've got to predict them, so the investors can due diligence it, and because they're the one taking the bet. And then you've got to measure it, and then you've got to publicly report on it. None of those three things are we very good at on this side of the pond. All right, I'll leave these notes for those who want to go a little deeper. But let's move to the next slide if we could. Let's do the case studies, because that's when this stuff starts to come to light. Let's go to the next slide. We did our first transaction. We got really excited about social impact bonds, 2014. You guys were way ahead of us. We overcomplicated them to death in the United States, didn't get very far. High transaction costs, took us forever to get them done. The European social impact bonds were just much more elegant and simple. We took a page out of your book and kind of tried to apply some of the lessons learned that you guys showed us on the environmental side. This first environmental impact bond we did in Washington, D.C. to scale a whole bunch of green infrastructure. Instead of building a $1 billion gray infrastructure tunnel, there were cost savings there were environmental benefits, there were health benefits, there were workforce development benefits. And we were able to use the municipal bond structure, which is, I recognize, a unique structure on this side of the pond, to do the first social impact bond that was actually a bond. And number two, had variable payments as to whether the green infrastructure performed as well as we predicted that it would. And that was an exciting, let's go to the next transaction here. That started to lead to other ones. Here's a little bit of the nerdy math, and I would, if anybody's interested in the nerdy math, please find us. We're nerds, and we'd love to take you through this slide and for about 20 hours. Let's go to the next slide. Hey, this transaction just closed yesterday. This is really exciting. I didn't realize it was going to close yesterday. I thought it was going to happen at the beginning of December, but it closed. So this is an extension. This is a replication of the DC Water Environmental Impact Bond that we did. We've been working with the city of Hampton, who's right on the coast and facing serious coastal degradation and flooding. And we just closed our environmental impact bond with them to pay for a whole bunch of green infrastructure to address their coastal resilience challenges. Let's move to the next slide. Here's the Buffalo Water Sewer Authority. This is in Buffalo, New York. This is an environmental impact bond where we used a similar but different structure than DC Water to pay for green infrastructure on private land. That's the difference. I wanted to highlight the difference there. We're starting to look for ways to finance the development and encourage green infrastructure on private land in urban centers. DC Waters was public land. So was the Hampton one we just talked about. So this is encouraging to have made that step on how to use public funds to encourage private citizens to profitably build green infrastructure to help with the stormwater challenges that most of our urban centers are dealing with. Okay, let's go to the next one here. This is an interesting one. I wanted to put this one in there just because I think it's kind of cool. This is a recreational infrastructure environmental impact bond in Southeastern Ohio. Southeastern Ohio is, there has been a lot of coal mining extractive businesses over the decades in Appalachian, Ohio. This is a very impoverished rural area where there happens to be a federal a national park called the Wayne National Forest. No one goes there. And as a result, all of the main streets around the perimeter of our national forest were not doing well. And so we used our environmental impact bond model to finance the development of a best-in-class mountain biking trail system as an attraction. Meaning, if they build it, they will come and they will do the perimeter, a 6-day ride around the perimeter of the Wayne National Forest. The payback mechanism that we did is we worked with all the governments around the perimeter of this enormous Wayne National Forest, and they pledged their hospitality bed taxes, meaning if humans choose to come to this attraction and they do the mountain biking trail, that means they will stay, they will get off at the various exits, they will eat at the diner, they will stay in the motel. If they stay in the motel, then they're spending money that gets triggered and $1 of that goes back to the investor. So again, it's a pay for success, outcomes-based transaction. And by the way, none of us were smart enough to do this on purpose, but man, when the pandemic hit, we thought this was gonna be game over for this transaction. It was the opposite. People just flock to this trail system, and it's full and thriving, and it's really exciting to see it actually work. Okay, let's go to the next one, and I'll try to keep moving along here. Really quickly, we are using the environmental outcome fund model, which is just an outcomes-based fund to finance the development of the interventions needed to reduce wildfires in Southwest Colorado. I'll leave that at the top line message because I'm going to save just a little bit of time for the last one on the next page. And this is, if we can flip to the next slide. Okay. And then I will leave everyone with the last one, which is our Soil and Water Outcomes Fund. This is a scalable model that we're doing in the Midwest in Washington, in the United States, where we pay farmers to profitably build 5 conservation practices at scale. And then we have offtake agreements with a lot global corporations like the Cargills, McDonald's, Pepsi's of the world. They buy the carbon, and then we have offtake agreements with 3 levels of government, municipal, state, and through the US Department of Agriculture to buy the water quality benefits. And then all we do is just add more acreage. We started with 10,000 acres, went to 200,000 acres, to 1 million acres, and it starts to scale across the Midwest. This is a really exciting development, and we've been working on this one for a couple years, and we just raised the capital to actually begin the scaling process across the Midwest. With that, I'll turn it back to Helen.
Thank you so much, Eric. Oh my God, so many diverse projects. I'm sure people are going to take you up on reaching out to you to talk about them and the 20-hour breakdown of that incredibly interesting slide. And just to note that we are going to be hearing about an environmental impact bond under development in the UK on Thursday as well, that Eric has had a hand in. So our final presenter is Darius Sarsha with SLM Silver Fund. Welcome, Darius. Darius is going to be sharing about the Continuous Coverage Forestry Fund in Ireland and their experience with working with investors. So all over to you, Darius. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Helen, and hello, everybody. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the SLM Silver Fund. It's an Irish forestry fund, and it's focused on continuous cover forestry. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the company. We're a kind of, I guess, a conventional asset management firm set up in 2009 to do unconventional things. So our mission is really to use investment capital to scale up regenerative agriculture and forestry systems, generating market-based returns, but significant environmental impact, and really trying to either assist or catalyze the transformation of the way land is managed. We've got offices in London, in New York, and Australia, and our main sort of our clients are really institutional investors and family offices and high net worth individuals. We've got $200 million in assets under management across 3 strategies, and we're just beginning to look at the new strategy, which I'll touch on before I get to the Irish forestry. Next slide, please. So the first strategy we developed was a grass-fed beef cattle in Australia using rotational grazing, and we also have some quite large carbon projects there, carbon offtake agreement with the Australian government around natural woodland regeneration. Next slide, please. Sustainable forestry in Ireland, that's the Irish Forestry Fund. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on that. That's a €30 million fund, 10-year fund. We're getting, at some point in next year, we'll reach full deployment. So we're looking at raising a successor fund and possibly incorporating UK-based investments in that. Next slide, please. I guess the third strategy is organic grains or grow crop strategy, where we buy farmland and lease it to farmers and support and finance their conversion to organics. And next slide. And we're just beginning to look at permanent row crops in Spain and Portugal, and also some forestry opportunities there in the hope that we can start investing there in the near future. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So, okay, so this is a typical Irish Irish countryside scene. I'll give you a quick guide to Irish forestry, so you have some context of what we're doing. So in the foreground, you can see some sort of rows of small trees that look like sort of shrubs at the moment. That was a bit of marginal grazing land which we've planted up, and so that's a brand new afforestation going on. In the background, you can see some blocks of more mature forestry, and you can see the sort of brown patch of land, which is where the forest was clear felled and is about to be replanted or has just been replanted. Now, in Ireland, approximately half of the Irish forests are publicly owned by a state-owned forestry company, and half of them are private. And most of that private forestry has been planted up in the last sort of since the 1980s, on the back of generous government grants, EU-backed government grants and annual income payments. And a lot of those forests are kind of reaching the end of those premium or income-based payment contracts, and so farmers are selling up in quite large numbers. Now, forests, generally speaking, are kind of low risk, low return assets that generate a kind of inflation-proof income, but they're very illiquid. So they're ideally suited to institutional ownership, and that's what we're trying to bring about here. But the typical Irish forest is about 8 hectares in size, a farm forest. So no institutional investor is able, you know, with assets in the billions, is able really to mess around buying individual farm forests in Ireland. So the fund strategy is to aggregate those into an institutional scale portfolio over time. Okay, next, just one thing. So the strategy of the fund, just go back a slide a second. So the strategy of the fund is to buy up some of the mature blocks of sort of monospecific, even-aged forestry that is mature, clear fellet, and start again with a more diverse species mix managed under continuous cover. Next slide, please. Or it's by mid-rotation. So this is a mid-rotation forest, maybe sort of 20 years old in County Wicklow. We've just recently put in the road so we can start a thinning operation. And we typically take forests like this and we start a thinning program that, so there's regular thinning every few years in perpetuity, and we maintain the forest cover. And the process of doing that thinning, we start to establish much more diversity in terms of the age structure and the size, and we start encouraging natural regeneration. So next slide, please. So this is a thinning operation, the first thinning operation. So we're using modern harvester technology. There's nothing particularly novel about that. But we're here. The first thinning is very similar to conventional. We take lines out and then we just selectively thin in between. But it's the nature of the thinning, and over time the divergence between what we do with our thinning and what conventional management does that turns these forests into something completely different. And there's no clear felling, so the permanent forest cover is maintained permanently. Next slide, please. So the important thing is that these forests, whilst we're generating something that's biodiverse and much higher and permanent carbon stocks, then they're not carbon museums. They're producing wood, and that's important because in order to optimize land use, if it has a productive function, in this case wood, this wood being taken out as thinnings, that supplies the bioenergy market, for example, displacing fossil fuels. Peat is very commonly widely burned in Ireland. It's also sort of equivalent of coal for the UK. And also a lot of this wood goes into sustainable building materials. So building houses, and the UK is a major importer of Irish wood. So panels and sawn timber go into UK construction and displacing concrete, steel, aluminium, plastics. There's a very high sort of substitution effect that timber plays in the overall climate footprint of the construction industry. Next slide, please. So over time, with thinning and a sort of heavy thinning rather than these sort of growing a forest to maturity and then cutting it all down, is you end up with natural regeneration. So you can see this one of our foresters standing in around sort of knee height, but there's a sort of carpet of regeneration of this commercial spruce species. Next slide. And you also get forests that look like this. You're beginning to see trees of different ages all in the same stand, which is something you just don't get in conventional forestry. So some of the key benefits of this approach are that you've got, next slide please, you get watershed protection. So on the right there, you've got this forest that's been managed under continuous cover about 10 years. You're just beginning to see the impact of those thinnings, that there's a little bit more diversity to the canopy structure than there would be in a conventional forest. But you can see how, that's on a watershed, how maintaining permanent forest cover will be very invaluable for maintaining soil and water quality in a situation like that. You're getting much more biodiversity because the forest is full of, it gets more light in it. There's trees of much different ages. There's natural regeneration. The soil is protected in perpetuity. There's no drastic exposure of the soil and volatilization of soil carbon at any point. But all these forests are also better, more climate adapted. So it makes them more resilient to storm damage, and the diversity means that you're less dependent on a single species if you have a pest and disease attack, and if your forests are attacked, your leading species, or you've got a storm damage and you've got natural regeneration, you're already years ahead, if not decades ahead. You don't have to replant and start from scratch. You've already got trees that have grown up underneath the canopy that you can work with. So next slide, please. So this is the same forest, but taking a step back and seeing it in a wider landscape. So we hope these forests will, they're more biodiverse, store more carbon, all the benefits I talk about, watershed protection, but also are a functional but very beautiful part of a very productive landscape. So a little bit about the structure of the fund before I finish. So The European Investment Bank was an anchor investor in the fund, and they invested through something called their natural capital financing facility, which meant that in addition to their equity investment in the fund, they also provided a €700,000 technical assistance grant, and that will be funding some R&D work to fill critical information gaps that are sort of obstacles to the large-scale adoption or take-up of continuous cover forestry and commercial forestry, and things like operational training for harvesting contractors, managers, and all of the carbon and biodiversity monitoring activities, which help us to track the impacts of the management system. The fund is a kind of a typical private equity style LP-GP structure, whereas unregulated fund, but with a regulated administrator that handles the accounts and so on. And we're a registered alternative investment fund manager, registered with the Central Bank of Ireland. The advantage is, while these LPGP structures are very typical, they're not particularly easy to manage. It means there's lots of different entities that with multiple contracts and so on. So it's quite time consuming. Registering these companies have all got filing, accounts, audit requirements and so on. So it can be quite complex. One of the advantages of this over a corporate structure is that there's some of the tax advantages available to forestry to provide incentives for investors to invest in forestry are passed on directly to investors, whilst also protecting their kind of limited liability. So they're liable only for the funds that they've put in rather than any additional sum. So it maintains that limited liability with all the tax benefits associated. And a sort of final point really about challenges. I guess our biggest challenge, well, some of these numbers might sound quite large in sort of forestry investment and real asset in alternative investment world. This is a tiny fund. And our biggest challenge really was we were too small to attract a lot of the institutional investors that are interested and would be interested in investing in this fund. Because forests in Ireland are so small, it takes some time to accumulate and aggregate and buy enough to make it institutional scale. And typically a fund would be given 3 to 4 years to deploy its capital. Otherwise it ends up sitting on money and drawing fees and incurring costs, and that drags down returns. So in 3 to 4 years, there's a limit to how many forests you can buy. If you're buying sort of 50 to 100, there's a limit to how quickly you can get that all processed. So that restricts you to smaller funds, and a lot of the institutions just, they want to put in 25 to 50 million, but they only want to be 10% of the fund. So it also means that we're actually slightly too big for some of the high net worths who, might want to put either several hundred thousand or maybe $1 million in, and it takes a lot of them to fill, a 30 to 50 million fund. So we're looking at, once we're fully deployed in Ireland, we're looking at adding maybe the UK, perhaps Spain, Portugal, perhaps some other countries to the mix, and offering a multi-country, perhaps a little bit more pan-European strategy that will open up the opportunity to a wider investor base. Thanks very much. Thanks, Helen. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Darius. It's really interesting, these productive landscapes, and it's a really a different model of the fund, so really appreciate it. So I see that we're running over, so I'm going to take the liberty of saying we're going to run over, and if that's going to be an issue, then the tech team can just let me know in the chat, because we'd really like to field some of these questions. So if we can bring back on all of our presenters, and then we will go through some of these questions. Alan, I believe you're up first. You've been patiently waiting in the wings for your question. So the first one is from David West from Forestry England. He says, you obviously can't have a rewilding centre in every part of the country. Is it, do you think, sort of the one-off and uniqueness is why this has been sort of viable, and do you feel it could be replicated and scaled across the UK?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. I think that the principle we looked at is what do we have to tell, and I think that the interest in rewilding that's in society at the minute, and where we are in the Highlands gave us that opportunity. But I think if you look at your place, look at the community around you, and think about what opportunities there might be from that, and that, I think that's where I would start looking at whether you have a visitor-based revenue opportunity or not, and then to think about how strong it is, and to really research how that can convert into revenue generation, and design yourself at a scale appropriate to that.
Wonderful, thank you. And these are all going to be quick fire rounds, so I really appreciate your brief answer as well, and thank you. We have another one for you. It's Romain Estev. I'm sorry if I'm butchering the names. I'm probably going to mispronounce a lot of names here, from the London Economics Consultancy. Again, for Alan, how do you ensure consistent measurement of land use and change over long periods of time?
Yes, stuff Eric was saying really chimed with me in that, in terms of predicting your impact and then being able to evidence that. And that's something we want to deepen. So we can, at the minute, we can monitor land use change, particularly in vegetation terms, and we know how that, and we can track their examples of how that leads to responses from wildlife, for instance. So in terms of a rewilding and a biological restoration, we can track those sorts of things. But where that takes time, that takes years for habitats to regenerate. So we're interested in going basically underground to what we previously just thought of as quite kind of invisible stuff, but looking at fungal responses in soil and soil processes, and whether introducing young trees to a landscape starts to influence that quite early. Can we pick up signs and give ourselves metrics that we can detect those signs, are ideally in the first 5 years from a rewilding intervention.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alan. And if we have time, we'll come back to you, because there are so many questions for every single one of you. I'm going to try and just take 2 for now. So Gwyn, over to you. A question from Dr. Rob McCall from Natural Resources Wales. Did you explore the potential investor market beyond Lloyd's? And if so, how did you do that?
At this stage, we didn't. We were fairly clear that we wanted to use short-term debt finance, really, so that rather than our traditional model where we would be using donative money, and then essentially the income in this case coming from the local authority over six years, essentially we're able to recoup the use of our donative money earlier, and to have Lloyd's carrying that for us. And in this case, the interest is largely paid by leasing the farm back to the farmer, who becomes a tenant, managing that according to a nature-friendly prescription that delivers the Soul Bunting prescriptions we need. So that creates just a very neat model. The next model would be scaling in terms of some of the fund management mechanisms we've been hearing from colleagues here.
Thank you. And another one from David Ruddock from Middlemarch Environmental. Have you attempted, Gwyn, to value other ecosystem services delivered through the habitat created for the Soul Bunting? You mentioned some of them, but just wondered if you'd valued them at all.
For this site, no. But as part of other land that we manage, we're certainly measuring a whole series of ecosystem services and so on. Yes, and particularly we were talking earlier about carbon. So in some of the peat bog restoration we've been doing, and taking, ironically, trees off deep peat in places like the Flow Country, measuring the carbon flux and really trying to, add to that bank of information we're going to need to make sure that we understand the impacts of the various interventions we're talking about. And if we're claiming something, that we've got fairly good science there to back it.
Thank you, Gwyn. Thank you. On to you, Eric. A question here from Charles Coap. How is verifying carbon sequestration under the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund?
Yeah,
and the water too, for that matter, he says. That's
a great question, and it's certainly emerging, as we all know. We worked backwards from the corporate buyers, and as opposed to moving left to right to them and saying, this is how we're going to do it, and you all need to be okay with that. We worked with corporate buyers who all have their opinions, and they're evolving as to how they need their particular carbon evaluated and validated. I think that's the short answer.
Brilliant, thank you. And a question here from Andy Bell from North Devon Biosphere Foundation. Who are your typical investors?
I wish I had an answer. We're a little all over the map, and it's growing, and we find the fact that that's growing just gives us more access to different types of capital to spackle in to actually make deals pencil.
Great. Over to you, Darius, now. Again, Andy Bell from North Devon Biosphere Foundation. He says, I'm a big fan of CCT. Have you proven a carbon increase through continuous coverage?
Yeah, the short answer is no. In Ireland, there's no national scheme. A lot of the international forest carbon schemes are just not functional in Europe and don't have CCF-based methodologies. But the Woodland Carbon Code, there's a lot of similarity between UK and Ireland species, growth and yield, management systems and so on. So there is within the Woodland Carbon Code a kind of perpetual thinning regime, which we've adapted in trying to anticipate the likely carbon sequestration of continuous cover. So we think it's much more favourable than clear fell and replant, but we're just beginning to develop the methodology in detail, and so we can only speculate at the moment.
Thank you. And one here from James Bryn from the Wildlife Trust Wales. How sustainable is the sustainable forestry? Obviously there's concern. People say, well, it's spruces, it's a lot of monoculture. Can you just sort of talk us through the biodiversity of the project?
Yeah, so I mean, there are places within Ireland where 20-30 years ago, and even as recently as 10 years ago, where spruce was planted where it should never have been planted, on peat, and for example, hen harrier habitat and so on. But now regulations are quite strict and require you to incorporate a degree of biodiversity. So we've got this sort of legacy of mature, semi-mature forests, which are sort of monospecific, even-aged, and will be clear-felled and expose the soil and will be replanted on the same system. So we think that continuous cover will, affect the sort of watershed management, soil water protection, but just by providing some kind of stability and continuity for the soil and the forest in microclimates and habitats within the forest, and then introducing more biodiversity through natural regeneration and the age structure diversity, you do bring in the biodiversity that enables these productive systems to also contribute to biodiversity. Now we're just starting to put in place our biodiversity and kind of monitoring and measurement programs, and we will have data the data will start emerging from that over the next couple of years to be able to be specific about how our management in specific places, what sort of impact it's having. But it's it's very difficult to measure and be specific about biodiversity because it's so diverse. But biologists often use proxies like forest cover, species diversity, species richness, and so on. And all of those will be enhanced and improved by continuous cover. So we can only guess that the outcome is likely to be favourable. But I also hope the Irish government will at some point recognise that in some places you can take, when we're trying to take forest off some peat sites. So where we've got forest on peat, we clear fell it and either re-wet and restore it to peat, or native forest. So we try native woodland, which is predominantly broadleaves. So we're trying to do that, but we're hampered a little bit because the government insists that if you've got a forest and it was grant aided, even if it was 30 years ago, you have to plant it to forest again, even if that's not the optimum land use. The UK government is more open-minded to changes in land use that are more biodiversity friendly. So we hope that's going to be the case in Ireland in the future.
Great, thank you. And so we are pretty much at time, so I'm going to do a quick once around and to ask you, if you had one piece of advice to give to projects out there as they're looking to get ready to be investment ready, something, I know it's hard, I'm just springing this on you right now, but just a one-liner of what it might be, or a one word, and we'll go around. Does anyone want to volunteer to go first? Otherwise I'm going to pick on Alan. Okay, Alan, it's you. I think you're muted.
Alan's on
Getting
mute.
away with it. Getting away with pondering.
Skip that. I'll go with clarity. Get your clarity right, and get your values right, so that what you're getting into is something that you and your investors are comfortable with. Thank you.
Gwyn, words of wisdom?
Don't be frightened. We've just had nothing but encouragement and support from the sector as we've tried to work out how to do this, and we're just genuinely appreciative of everybody who's helped us on the way.
Thanks, Gwyn. It's very encouraging. Eric?
Think big, be bold, and be hypothesis driven. This work is 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Right, thank you. So good book and go home, as Alan said earlier. And Darius, what about you? What's your tip?
Yes, I would say that, if you're selling, if your model is based on ecosystem services or revenue from tourism and so on, it's important to get your market clear first before you try and raise capital or launch your projects on. Believe you me, there are projects out there that start first anticipating a market and that never materializes. So lock in your market, you say forward sell your whatever you're going to sell, credits, environmental, first. And then the second thing is, when it comes to raising institutional money, that might be a tiny fraction of those that are interested in the IRF, but it's really it's not something I would you can't just launch yourself into it. You need to be able to demonstrate track record and so on. And first time fund managers find it very difficult to raise capital. So I would suggest that you partner with an asset manager or someone that has a track record that you can lean on, if you like, if you want to raise institutional money.
Great. Thank you so much for all your presentations and the help that you're giving to others as they start or are in the midway of this journey. So that's about all we have time for. This is recorded, this session, so you'll get some information about where you can access this recording afterwards. I know we didn't have time for so many of the questions. I'm sorry about that. Maybe we'll have everyone back in the new year, one-on-one, but if they agree. But a really big thank you to our presenters, and thank you to the audience for joining us. We'd also just like to remind all attendees that we are also holding breakout sessions on the IRF on the 2nd and 9th of December. These sessions are going to offer potential applicants the opportunity to ask questions of policy officials and investors in a more intimate virtual setting. If you'd like to join and you haven't received any information yet, you can email me, helen.avery@gfi.green, or my colleague Brendan Curran, brendan.curran@gfi.green. You can find us on the World Wide Web if you need those emails again. Specific to the IRF sessions, we have more presentations Thursday, so please join us then, and a panel tomorrow with investors, banks and intermediaries to talk through what they're looking for. And you can find all the details of those sessions on the conference agenda. So thanks for being with us in this bit of a whirlwind tour of projects. We hope it's been really useful, and thanks again to our wonderful presenters, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Bye.